Orangetown British art from the George Way collection is more than just a collection of masterworks from England. We also want to call attention to Colonial Loyalists. A bit of a talk now by two experts.
On October 14, 2017, the Orangetown Historical Museum and Archives will premiere a new exhibit entitled Loyal to the Crown, Art from the Collection of George Way. It's an exhibit of over 120 objects and oil paintings from the collection of George Way, dating back to the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. One of the early pieces is dated 1580. George has an extensive collection of Dutch as well as British art that he's been collecting for the last 50 years of his life. And because of the nature of these objects, British art and objects, we thought we might examine a time where people were reconsidering should they be loyal to the crown. What caused this? Todd Braisted has done extensive research on the subject, and he is the leading researcher on Loyalists. His research has taken him to the National Archives, State Archives, and various historical societies, and even to the United Kingdom. He has written numerous papers. He is past president of the Bergen County Historical Society and a member of a Loyalist reenactment group. Todd, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Todd, why was your interest provoked concerning Loyalists?
It was a need that had to be filled. I remember in high school reading a paper on Bergen County Loyalists, and I'm from Bergen County, saying, this is back in the 60s, that it's a subject that needed much further study. And since the 1960s, it had not received any further study. So there's plenty of people who out there do a wonderful job of researching George Washington and whatnot, but they needed someone to do the other side.
What do you think were the primary causes for the unrest in the colonies?
There was many things. A famous U.S. politician once said that all politics is local. So there were different reasons for, say, New England and the middle colonies and the South. Much of it has to do with local representation. All the colonies had various forms of different governments that had self-government. Places like Connecticut and Rhode Island had elected governors. New Jersey had a royal governor with an elected assembly. New York, of course, had its own royal governor. But the idea that there was no representation in England, in Parliament, to represent directly the colonists' needs, that was a primary factor. Of course, economics. The British wanted to directly tax the Americans. The Americans wanted to have their own say in how much they should be taxed and to where that tax money should go. Not so much the taxes should be paid, but the process of how it was. And the American colonies by that point were over 150 years old, and you start to get anxious to leave the house and you go off onto your own.
See. Well, within the general population, there were some folks who weren't exactly happy about separating from England. They were called Loyalists, and they wanted to remain loyal to the crown. There were some other issues, though, that related to the Reformed Church. How did this affect the attitude of the Loyalists?
Well, we're dealing with a local issue here, obviously. Religion, different sects of Christianity, Protestantism were prevalent in different parts of the colonies. And the Dutch church, which is what you're referring to here, was prevalent in Orange County, Bergen County, and different parts of the Hudson Valley, had itself received a bit of a schism concerning, we might think, trivial reasons where ministers were to be trained, whether it be Holland or whether it be in America. The conservative faction thought they had to be trained in Holland. But that sort of dovetailed with some people's political viewpoints, whether they remain conservative and with the established government as with the established church, or perhaps it's time to move on to something new and untried. And let's be honest, the United States was a completely new sort of government. It wasn't just a rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It was a rebellion for something new, a new form of government. And if you look at the church, the Dutch church, they were looking for something new as well. Again, where ministers are trained we might think is very minor, but to them, that sort of change radical, and it did affect some people's perceptions towards each other. If your neighbor feels another way about this, then what else does he feel different about? So if you want to hate him for one thing, you may as well hate him for other things as well.
Well, who are some of the leading loyalists in Orange County?
Orange County, obviously, bigger then than it is today because it includes Rockland County, as most people probably know. But the main figures of Orange County was with the Bayard family. Bayard family is an incredibly wealthy, powerful political entity in New York. Pre-war politics. William Bayard, the head of the family. His son John was a British Army officer. When the American Revolution broke out, Bayard remained loyal to the British. He had been a colonel in the Orange County militia. He, of course, was stripped of that by the new rebellious faction. And in December of 1776, he used his influence to raise a regiment in Orange County for the British that was given to his son, John Bayard, to command, and his other son, Samuel Vetch Bayard, to be the second in command of eventually. Another one of the more local loyalist families, the DeWint family. Garrett S. DeWint became the major of this regiment, which was known as the King's Orange Rangers. The orange, obviously, a reference to Orange County. And during the course of the war, they raised hundreds of men to serve the British. So the Bayard family, and William Bayard in particular, went off to New York City as the Loyalists could remain up here, exerted considerable influence of letter writings back home to Lord Germain and the progress of the war and whatnot. But certainly, if you're looking for a top political figure, top loyalist in Orange County is your guy.
Now, what happened to these loyalists after the Revolutionary War?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, they couldn't all stay around here. As you know, locally, Abraham Lent, a good local loyalist, went off with the British in 1778, had to leave his property behind. The Bayards left their property behind. And most of these loyalists who joined the British left their properties behind. Those properties were, by and large, confiscated by the state of New York and auctioned off for sale to help pay for the revolution. They couldn't go home for the most part, particularly the more prominent ones. They were what they call proscribed and banished. They were tried, mostly in absentia, and said, don't come back here, we don't want you. Now, oftentimes, as years went on, they did. Time heals all wounds. But for many of them, particularly right at the end of the Revolution, they went off to settle in what was left of British North America. Now, when these people stayed enlisted in the Bayards Regiment, the King's Orange Rangers, and all the other loyalist groups that were raised, they were promised free land at the end of the war. That's something the British had done after the French and Indian War and was very popular. Most of the rank and file members of the military were not landowners, they were laborers or others who were not property owners. Well, the British had promised them, if you were just a private soldier, 100 acres of free land. And if you're not a landowner, that's a powerful incentive, inducement to enlist in the army. Well, at the end of the war, the British had to fulfill this promise. Their original promise was to give away the land in New York. Well, they were no longer in a position to give away land in New York. So they had to look around to where else they could give land. And that, for the most part, was in the maritime provinces of modern Canada, or in Quebec, or in what we now know as Ontario, then known as Upper Canada. And the British gave out this free land based upon your rank, or for a civilian, your sex. Males got 100 acres, a female would get 50, and each child 50 acres as well. And it sounds like a good deal, but when you realize that New York City, the final evacuation wasn't until November of 1783, and all this new land in Nova Scotia, what is now the province of New Brunswick, was not surveyed, and nor would it be for another year or two. That meant you had to go up there with your family and spend the winter up there in a floorless tent. So it was very harsh conditions. So you had to really maintain your loyalty to get through that. And many, enough people couldn't that they came back to the U.S. It was just, we like to think of all our ancestors as big strapping fellows who could just take an axe and build their own house by lunchtime. But
It didn't happen that way.
it did not happen that way. I mean, you look at the beautiful house we're sitting in today, and you know that that house took quite a time to be constructed by many hands. So everybody going up to Nova Scotia was, pretty much in the same boat. Outside of Halifax and a few other towns, it was mostly a wilderness. And some of the women and children, upon seeing this wilderness before them, just burst out into tears. So it was a very traumatic experience for them.
I would imagine that it was very harsh, the winters.
Sure, I mean, there's a reason you don't see around here vacation tourism commercials for Nova Scotia in January. Working the Andre.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Baylor massacre that occurred in Bergen County, just over the New York State line in Oakland?
Well, that's an interesting episode, part of a much larger series of events that occurred in September and October of 1778, involved the obtaining of forage for the British Army at the time. A two-pronged attack was planned on the American troops that were keeping an eye on the 6,000 British Loyalist troops in Bergen County. 400 militia were at Japan to keep an eye on things around there. And 130 American cavalry under George Baylor were spending the night in Rivervale on their way to Clarkstown, where they were going to join an American brigade sent from Westchester by George Washington. Again, not to attack the British, but to sort of deter them from wanting to come up here to Orange County and keep an eye on things. Well, the column of British troops sent against Japan under Lord Cornwallis failed because two of his troops deserted, ran into a militia patrol in Closter, and spirited them up to Japan, where they said, the British are coming, get out of here. And they did, they retreated out of there. But none of those militia went over down the road into Bergen County and warned George Baylor of his impending disaster. 1,500 British troops under General Gray were moving up from Newbridge, modern River Edge, to attack Baylor's men, where they found them sleeping in 6 barns, these nice big Dutch barns. And in the middle of the night, they attacked them with such ferocity. They killed 16 of these, mostly Virginia cavalrymen, outright. They mortally wounded 5 others. Baylor himself was seriously wounded. His second-in-command, Major Clow, was mortally wounded. And it came down in history as Baylor Massacre, and was brought to light in the 20th century by the excavation of the remains of several of the cavalrymen when a housing development was being put in in Rivervale. Once the bodies were uncovered, a stop was put to the construction and the desecration of the site, and that today is Baylor Park in Rivervale. And it actually has an interesting to Pan connection for later years, because the aide-de-camp, the assistant to General Gray, who was commanding that column, was none other than the famous John Andre. People who watched Hearn on television certainly are familiar with John Andre. And in 1780, of course, he was the British Adjutant General under the Commander-in-Chief, Sir Henry Clinton, and was involved in the famous Benedict Arnold affair, and which led to his premature demise at the hangman's noose in Japan.
Todd, I understand there was a blockhouse that was built in Sneed's Landing, and that plans for it were given to Abraham Lent by a friend who had visited the blockhouse and given him a sketch of what the blockhouse looked like to pass along to the British. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, the blockhouse at Stevens came about in 1780, right around the time that George Washington's army moved down from Orangetown into Bergen County to conduct their own foraging. And they had a small post. It was variously between 25 and 50 or 60 men. It was not any great big fort, like Fort Lee might have been, but a post that would be proof against cannonball, keep the men secure. Well, the British knew all about this post through the local inhabitants, who were loyalists. And this sketch that you allude to was turned over to a local Orangetown loyalist named Eunice Blauvelt, who was a lieutenant in the British service. Blauvelt gave the information in early 1781 to John Andre's successor, another New York loyalist named Oliver Delancey Jr. The Delanceys, like the Bayards, had been big political figures in New York well before the war, all through the 18th century. And Oliver Delancey Jr. was the new British Adjutant General, even though he was a loyalist, not a regular born in Britain sort of person, but his family was well represented on the British side. His dad was a general commanding loyalist regiments. Oliver Delancey Jr. picked up the baton from Andre and took over the intelligence gathering aspects, and Blauvelt was one of the conduits through which this intelligence came. There was at least one or two expeditions to go and attack the blockhouse at Stevens Landing. They never happened. For reasons, well, in one case we don't know. The British troops on board ship sent up the Hudson to attack it. Never happened. And no one wrote by. They didn't. The other was a loyalist expedition coming up from Bergen Neck to go and attack it, and they got within 3 miles, which would put them around Closter by the time they got stopped by the Bergen County militia. But that's as close as there ever came to being a sort of battle at Sneedens.
I see. Okay, well, thank you. What was happening around New York City at that time, and how many British soldiers appeared and chased after the Continentals. So if you get an opportunity, I do recommend reading this very exciting book. Thank you, Todd.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so very much for having me.